Max had always been a loving and devoted husband. He worked hard every day, and his greatest joy was coming home to his wife Emma, the woman he thought he could trust with his heart. Their marriage, once full of laughter and love, had slowly started to show cracks. Max couldn't put his finger on what had changed, but Emma had become distant. Long hours at work, secretive phone calls, and a coldness that had started to seep into their once warm relationship. Max didn't want to believe his suspicions, but when he found a strange, unreadable message on her phone one evening, his heart dropped. It was from a number he didn't recognize, and the words were clear: "I miss you. Can't wait to see you tonight." Max was devastated. He tried to confront Emma, but she brushed him off, claiming it was just a friend from work. But the lies piled up, and Max couldn't ignore the growing evidence. His wife, the woman he had loved for so long, was seeing someone else. The days that followed were torture. Max watched as Emma continued her affair, pretending that everything was fine, all while his world was falling apart. His love for her turned to anger, but more than that, he felt humiliated. He had to make her feel the pain she had caused him, and that's when the plans started to form in his mind. Max began his own investigation. He carefully followed Emma on her dates, taking note of every small detail. He discovered that the man she was seeing was Thomas, a colleague of hers from the office. He was everything Max wasn't: charismatic, confident, and carefree. But Max was about to make sure that Thomas would feel the same devastation that he had. Max's plan was simple but cruel. He knew Emma would never believe that her affair had been discovered, so he began to play his own game. He started an affair of his own, one that he kept hidden from her. He sent mysterious texts and flirted with women in front of her, carefully planting seeds of jealousy and insecurity. At first, Emma didn't seem to notice, but soon enough, she began to question him, accusing him of betrayal. Max played the part of the oblivious, hurt husband, pretending to be shocked and upset. As she grew more paranoid and anxious, Max fed her fears, knowing it would only push her further into her own web of lies. The turning point came when Emma invited Thomas over one night, hoping to keep their secret safe. Max, however, had already set the stage for the perfect moment of truth. As Emma and Thomas arrived at their house, Max was already waiting, sitting calmly with a glass of wine, his demeanor icy. When Emma saw him, her face went pale. She was caught, but it was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. Max simply looked at her and said, "You've made your choice." The final blow came when Max showed Emma a series of photos, pictures of her and Thomas together, moments she thought were hidden. She realized then that her own lies had been exposed, but it was Max's betrayal that stung the most. With the affair unraveling before her, Emma was left to face the consequences of her actions. Max had won. He had shown her what it felt like to be betrayed and humiliated, but the damage had already been done. Their marriage, once built on trust and love, was now nothing more than ashes, and Max was finally free from the woman who had broken his heart. Max's cruel revenge wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his power. And Emma, lost and regretful, was left with nothing but the shattered remnants of a love she had thrown away after the confrontation. Emma was left reeling. The shame of being caught in her lies and the betrayal from Max hit her like a freight train. She had thought she could keep her secret safe, that she could continue living in her double life without repercussions. But Max's coldness, his calculated revenge, left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She could see the contempt in his eyes. The once gentle husband, now a stranger, hardened by the pain she had caused. In the days that followed, Emma tried to salvage whatever was left of her dignity. She attempted to reach out to Max, desperate to explain herself, to beg for forgiveness. But Max was no longer the man she had married. He had moved beyond the point of forgiveness. Every attempt to talk was met with silence or sharp words that pushed her further away. He had made his peace, and it wasn't with her. Max, however, wasn't completely heartless. He gave Emma one last chance to understand the depth of her actions, but it wasn't for her. This was for him. He wanted her to feel the emptiness of losing everything. He started the process of divorce, ensuring she would receive no alimony, no part of their shared assets. Emma had to watch helplessly as the life she had once known slipped away. Max made sure every decision was in his favor, leaving her with nothing but a sense of utter failure. Meanwhile, Thomas, the man Emma had been seeing, had no idea of the game that Max had been playing. As Emma tried to explain what had happened, Thomas showed his true colors. He was not interested in the long-term consequences of their affair. He had only wanted a thrill. Emma soon realized that he was never going to be her savior, as she had once hoped. Thomas moved on quickly, leaving Emma to pick up the pieces of a life she had destroyed. For weeks, Emma was lost. She no longer had the safety net of her marriage or the excitement of an affair. Her world was full of regret and loneliness. Max, on the other hand, found a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing that he had taken control of his own fate. He moved on with his life, focusing on his career and rediscovering who he was outside of his failed marriage. There were moments of pain, yes, but those moments were fleeting compared to the peace he felt at no longer being bound to the woman who had betrayed him. As time passed, Emma's reputation began to crumble. The story of her affair spread through their social circle, and people began to whisper. She lost friends, and her once sturdy career started to falter as well. The guilt and shame weighed heavily on her, especially when she realized the depth of her actions. Max had been right to leave her. He had known all along that she was never going to change. Months later, Emma found herself alone, a shadow of the woman she had once been. Her attempts at mending her broken heart only left her more bitter. But the more she reflected, the more she came to understand just how much she had taken Max for granted. She had torn apart the one person who had truly loved her, and now she had no one left. Max, in contrast, had moved forward with his life. He had found peace in his solitude, and in time, he began to open his heart again. But this time, he was more guarded, more cautious. He had learned that love was something to be cherished, not taken for granted. And while Emma's betrayal had scarred him, it had also made him stronger. Emma, on the other hand, would forever carry the weight of her choices. The cruelty of Max's revenge had taught her a lesson she could never forget. Betrayal had consequences, and those consequences could tear apart everything you held dear. The love she had once known with Max was gone forever, and she had no one to blame but herself. As months turned into years, Emma's life became a slow, painful cycle of self-reflection and regret. She tried to rebuild her career, but the whispers of her past affair lingered, affecting her reputation in ways she could never undo. She found herself socially isolated, her former friends either turning their backs on her or offering only polite, distant interactions. The guilt gnawed at her, and though she tried to move forward, it was clear she would never escape the shadow of her betrayal. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, consumed by memories of Max. The warmth of his embrace, the tenderness in his eyes when they first met. Those were the moments she cherished the most, the days when their love had been real. But now those memories felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of everything she had lost. She knew she could never have that back. Max, for his part, had learned to forgive, not for Emma's sake, but for his own. The pain of the betrayal had dulled over time, replaced by a quiet understanding that life went on. His career had flourished, and he had even started dating again, though he was careful to keep his heart shielded. He had become more cautious, more guarded, but he also understood the importance of healing and growth. One evening, out of the blue, Emma reached out to Max. She hadn't heard from him in months, and despite everything, a part of her longed for closure. She asked if they could meet, a simple request that sent a rush of anxiety through her chest. She didn't know what she hoped for, a chance to apologize, to explain herself, or to just see him one last time. But something deep inside told her that if she didn't try, she would never truly move on. Max agreed to meet, though he did so without any expectations. He had nothing left to prove to her, but he understood the need for closure, for both of them. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, the place where they had once shared so many hopeful conversations. When Emma arrived, she looked different, aged, worn down by the weight of her decisions. She had once been so full of life and energy, but now there was an emptiness in her eyes that Max couldn't ignore. She sat across from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was selfish. I ruined everything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I need you to know how sorry I am. I hurt you in a way I can never take back." Max looked at her for a long time, his gaze unreadable. His anger had long since dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. He nodded slowly, though he didn't speak right away. There was nothing more to say. No words could change the past. But in that moment, Max realized something. The pain of betrayal had shaped him, yes, but it had also freed him. He didn't need Emma's apology to heal. He had already done that on his own. "I think we both lost something," Max said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But we also found our own paths. I'm not angry anymore, Emma. I haven't been for a long time." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, a final glimmer of hope fading away. She had always thought that if she apologized enough, maybe Max would come back. But she understood now that some wounds were too deep to heal. The man she had once loved had moved on, and so had she. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then Emma stood up, her shoulders slumped, and with a final glance at Max, she walked away. Max watched her leave, a part of him still holding on to the memories of their past, but he knew he was free. Their story had ended, and it was time for both of them to start anew. As Emma disappeared into the distance, Max realized that the revenge he had taken so long ago had given him something he hadn't expected. Peace. The heartache, the betrayal, the cruel games they had played. It had all led him to this moment, where he could walk away without regret. And though Emma's journey would be far more difficult, it was hers to make. The consequences of her actions would follow her forever, but perhaps, in time, they would be the very lessons she needed to change. For Max, life had gone on, and though the scars of his past remained, they no longer defined him. He was a man reborn from the ashes of his marriage, stronger and wiser, and ready for whatever the future might bring. Years passed, and life for both Max and Emma evolved in ways neither of them had expected. The scars from their past never fully disappeared, but they began to fade, replaced by the quiet understanding that they had both paid the price for their mistakes. Max had continued to move forward, finding a new sense of purpose in his work and personal life. He had even met someone new, someone who understood the fragility of trust and the importance of honesty. Their relationship was slower, more patient, built on the lessons Max had learned from his painful experience with Emma. He was more cautious, but also more present, fully appreciating the value of a love that didn't take anything for granted. Emma, on the other hand, had struggled for a long time to rebuild her life. The betrayal she had inflicted on Max had left deep emotional wounds, ones that couldn't be mended by time alone. Her attempts at new relationships had often been doomed from the start, weighed down by the guilt and regret she still carried. She had tried therapy, self-help books, and even changing cities, thinking that perhaps a fresh start would erase the damage of her past. But the truth was, no matter how much she tried to move forward, the consequences of her choices were always there, lingering just beneath the surface. It wasn't until Emma encountered a moment of profound self-realization that things began to shift for her. One evening, years after her confrontation with Max, she found herself sitting in front of an old mirror, looking at her reflection with a new kind of clarity. She had spent so much time blaming the world, blaming Max, even blaming herself, but she had never truly taken full responsibility for the choices she had made. "I broke something beautiful," she whispered to herself, "and I can't undo it." But there, in the quiet of her room, She realized that acknowledging her fault, owning her mistakes, was the first step toward any real healing. She had lived too long in the shadows of her regrets, hoping for forgiveness from others, when the most important forgiveness she needed was from herself. Emma started making small changes in her life. She worked on letting go of the bitterness that had once consumed her. She reached out to a few old friends, those who hadn't judged her too harshly, and began rebuilding the relationships that were worth salvaging. It was a slow process, and there were moments when she doubted herself, but she persevered. In the meantime, Max's life was full, and he had found a sense of peace he had never imagined possible. He had learned to trust again, though he still carried the wisdom from his past experiences. He didn't hold grudges, but he also knew the value of being cautious with his heart. His new relationship flourished, built on mutual respect and understanding. But he would always carry a small piece of the man he had once been, the man who had loved Emma with an open heart. One day, as if fate had decided to weave their paths together once more, Max and Emma crossed paths in the city. It was a coincidence, one that neither had planned, but in that brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. They looked at each other, not with the intensity of old love or the bitterness of betrayal, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the journey each had taken since their marriage fell apart. They didn't speak at first. There were no apologies, no words of reconciliation. Instead, they simply exchanged a glance that held the weight of everything they had been through. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was understanding, a mutual recognition that they had both suffered and grown. Emma spoke first. "I've changed," she said, her voice soft but steady. Max nodded, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "I can see that." And just like that, they walked away from each other again, no longer bound by the past but with a deep sense of closure. There was no need for further words, no more need to relive the pain. It was over, finally and fully. As they continued on their separate paths, each of them understood something essential. The cruelty of Max's revenge had been a necessary chapter in their story, a painful but important part of their healing. But life had moved on. Max had reclaimed his happiness, and Emma, though scarred, was learning to rebuild hers. They had both learned what it meant to forgive, not just each other, but themselves. For Max, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about strength, resilience, and moving forward with grace. For Emma, it was about redemption, starting anew, no longer as the woman who had betrayed her husband, but as someone capable of learning from her past mistakes. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could change what she did with the rest of her life. And in the end, that was all either of them could really hope for. Years later, Max and Emma had both carved out lives that were different from what they had once imagined. Max had found peace in the life he had rebuilt, and he was no longer haunted by the past. He had married again, this time to someone who valued honesty and shared his views on love. Their relationship was grounded in mutual trust, a stark contrast to the turmoil he had experienced with Emma. But every so often, when he looked back on their time together, he couldn't help but think about the lessons that had shaped him into the person he had become. He had learned to love deeply but wisely, to hold on to a sense of self, and to cherish the quiet moments of peace that came with healing. Emma, on the other hand, had finally learned to live without the weight of her past constantly dragging her down. After years of introspection and growth, she had taken responsibility for her actions, no longer hiding from the consequences of her betrayal. She had started a new career, one that was rooted in helping others, something that allowed her to give back, to make amends in a way that felt true to her. She had even found love again, though she was careful not to rush into anything. She knew that trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild, and she had learned to be patient, not only with others but also with herself. Though their paths had diverged, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Every year, on the anniversary of their divorce, Emma would send Max a simple message. "I hope you're well." It wasn't an attempt at rekindling anything, nor was it an apology. It was just a quiet acknowledgement of the shared history that had shaped both of them. Max never responded, But each time, he read the message with a sense of peace, knowing that their story had come full circle. One winter afternoon, years after their last encounter in the city, Max was walking through the park when he saw Emma from a distance. She was sitting on a bench, looking out at the frozen lake, wrapped in a scarf, her face serene and contemplative. He paused for a moment, watching her, unsure if she had noticed him. She hadn't changed much. There was still that quiet strength in her posture, that air of resilience he remembered so well. Max didn't approach her. Instead, he just stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of her, a woman who had once been everything to him and now was simply a part of his past. In that brief instant, he realized how far they had both come. They had both endured suffering, but they had also found healing, even if it was in different ways. They had both learned what it meant to live with the consequences of their choices, and in doing so, they had each become better versions of themselves. Emma turned her head slightly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Neither of them smiled, but there was a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared, everything they had lost, and everything they had gained. It wasn't forgiveness or regret. It was simply an understanding that their story had ended, but they were both okay. Max took a deep breath, feeling the chill of the air on his face. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if saying goodbye to the version of himself that had been broken by Emma's betrayal. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying finally lift off his shoulders. Emma, too, sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on her own journey. The pain of her past would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined her. She had made mistakes. She had caused hurt, but she had also learned to forgive herself. She had found peace within herself, even if it wasn't the same peace Max had found. She was content in her own way. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting a golden hue over the winter landscape, Emma took a deep breath, feeling the stillness around her. She didn't need to chase after her past anymore. She had let go, and she was free. The past had shaped her, but it no longer held power over her. In the quiet of the evening, Emma finally felt at peace with the life she had built, knowing that, in the end, she had done the best she could with the lessons she had learned. Max and Emma's story was no longer a painful chapter, but a distant memory. Both had learned from their mistakes. And though they would never be the same people they were when they first met, they had each found their own version of redemption. Their paths would never cross again in any meaningful way, but that was okay. They had both moved on, and that, in itself, was the final victory. In the end, it was a story of betrayal, revenge, and the cruel cost of love lost. But it was also a story of healing, growth, and the quiet power of letting go.